Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Kaguyu AA Wash Process Kenya from S&W Craft Roasting. And there's the bag right there. And S&W, based out of Coatesville, Indiana. And this coffee was featured in our most recent blind taste test rankings video, where it finished first place out of 7 S&W coffees on that day. And if you watched that video, then you saw that I was immediately able to pick this one out as being the Kenyan coffee because it did offer plenty of Kenyan-like attributes, including the brightness and red berry components that are typically associated with Kenyan coffees. In addition to that, the main reason it finished as my favorite coffee was because it interestingly offered the most intensity out of any of the coffees on that table. One of my favorite things about those blind taste test videos is seeing whether or not the coffee that finished first place in those videos does end up being my favorite by the end of the time that we've reviewed it. So we will see if that was the case with this one. This right here is day 34. And quick note on this one, once again, that this is a sample 100 gram sized bag of coffee. So this will be a slightly shorter review. But the recipe we went with for this one was, once again, S&W's recipe at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 99 degrees Celsius, about 210 degrees Fahrenheit. And I also happen to like this one best through the Chemex, which indicates a more medium grind roast profile for this coffee. As I've alluded to in our previous S&W reviews, this one is technically the most developed of the coffees that we are reviewing, as this one had a lower score based off of the charting system that S&W does have on their website. That being said, it's still very much on par with the rest of the coffees that we've reviewed from them, as I don't necessarily think that it was too noticeable in terms of the difference, which is to say that this one still is on the slightly lighter side of things, as I feel like a lot of people could either say that this is a slightly more developed version of a light profiled coffee, or on the lighter side of a light medium in terms of that roast profile. With all that out of the way, let's go ahead and start discussing this coffee. Day 12, first impression, and it was that blind taste test day. And once again, I was immediately able to detect this coffee due to the notable Kenyan brightness with plenty of the classic red berry and savory attributes to it. Interestingly, it definitely was the most intense of the coffees on that table, though still on the more subtle side of things, as they continue to harp on the fact that all of those coffees did feel a little too fresh to be consumed on that day. We move on to day 16 as we opted for the Chemex, and the cup was already a fair bit better as it was offering more intensity as it continued to skew in the direction of the bright red berry aspects typically associated with Kenyan coffees. In addition to that, there were plenty of these stone fruits in a darker sense reminiscent of plums, but also some red florality in an herbal sense. So a lot of the things you'd expect from a Kenyan coffee definitely present within this one. We move on to day 19 as we opted for the April dripper, and the cup has been pretty consistent up to this point as it continues to offer an abundance of vintage Kenyan-like attributes, with the focus being on the brightness and red berry aspects. Yet again, not too much to add to that. We move on to day 22 as we opted for the V60 with S&W's recipe, and the cup wasn't quite as good as it had been on previous days, with it skewing a little bit more on the savory side of things without as much of the sweetness and intensity. Interestingly, not quite as much brightness either, as it continues to focus primarily on the red aspects of the cup. So that was a little bit of a transition and a little bit of a change, and the first time we hadn't seen consistency within this one. But on day 26, we opted for the Chemex with S&W's recipe, and this was by far the best the coffee had been up to this point, as it's offering the molasses-like sweetness to the cup this time around, with some subtle plum and even a bit of peachiness to the cup as well. The rest of the coffee continues to offer a fair bit of brightness and sweetness in a candied sense, with plenty of the red berry aspects yet again. So a very nice day, and that takes us into that day 30 mark as we opted for the Chemex with S&W's recipe one more time. And it's nice both off brew and as it cools down, with more of the fruit forward aspects, including the plums and slight peachiness, as well as the bright red berry aspects to the cup. More of the candied sweetness and slight molasses-like dark sweetness to the cup as well. So a little bit of depth to this one, even for it being a pretty straightforward wash-processed Kenyan coffee. All right, let's go ahead and pull up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. We have a lot of level 4s, so we'll start with the cleanliness level 4. And when it comes to wash processed Kenyan coffees, that's not necessarily always a given, as sometimes the tomato-like aspects can hinder the overall clarity and cleanliness of a Kenyan coffee. but it's not something I even necessarily mentioned, as the savoriness is a little bit more in line with the red berries, and even then I would say a little bit more in line with the florality and perhaps slightly more tea-like. So there really wasn't much detection of any sort of tomato-like attributes to this one, which is really nice, and that's why the cleanliness is very much justified there at that level 4 mark, as S&W's coffees continue to remain very clean, so massive credit to them once again, as oftentimes Kenyan coffees are hindered by that specifically. Finish, level 4. And it has the classic Kenyan-like finish. The brightness is very much present within it, and plenty of those slightly savory, tart, red berry attributes to this one. So once again, scoring there at that level 4, while in addition offering a little bit of depth in terms of the stone fruit qualities, makes it a very enjoyable finish to this coffee. Sweetness, level 4. And once again, that's not necessarily always a given when it comes to Kenyan coffees, as oftentimes the brightness can be overpowering when it comes to sweetness. But I did appreciate that the sweetness came in a multitude of directions, most specifically that sort of dark molasses-like attribute, and in addition to that, a candied-like attribute to it as well. So having it there at that level 4, while still offering plenty of the Kenyan-like components to it, did make it very enjoyable. Acidity, level 4, and that's something I've continued to harp on with the natural process coffees that we've reviewed from S&W. The main reason they couldn't score that level 4 was because this one was the true demonstration and representation of what the level 4 was supposed to be, as there were plenty of brighter attributes to it. And once again, even with the coffee being a little bit more subtle and toned down on that first impression, the brightness stood out to the point where I'm like, yeah, this is Kenyan coffee. It's pretty obvious, and for that reason, it does justify itself there at that level 4 mark. Florality, level 4. And once again, it's coming in that slightly more herbal, slightly more savory side of things, so hibiscus feels like the ideal floral note to kind of identify within this coffee, so don't have too much to add to that. Berry fruit, level 4, once again, classic Kenyan-like component to it, plenty of those currants, those darker berry attributes in a much more tart sense, and plenty of brightness to them as well, so a lot of what you would expect and experience from Kenyan coffees in that regard. Then we have a couple of level 3s. We'll start with the citrus fruit, level 3. Same thing when it comes to Kenyan coffees. Oftentimes I do experience plenty of the citric-like qualities to them as well, and that's no exception to this coffee. Stone fruit, level 3. Once again, slightly darker attributes to it. Plums, which is something I experience with a lot of Kenyan coffees, but in addition to that, that slightly more subtle peachiness to this coffee did seem to give it just a little bit more in terms of the fruit profiles of it. And then, honestly, only one other thing worth discussing, and that is the body at a level 2. And the main reason it's worth discussing is because this is a Kenyan coffee, and I wouldn't say that it's overly common for these Kenyan coffees to score that low in terms of the body, as it didn't necessarily have that juicy Kenyan-like body that you typically experience from these coffees. The Chemex might have been slightly at play with the way that it turned out, but it was kind of surprising to me that it didn't necessarily have as much of a body as a lot of the other either coffees that we'd reviewed from S&W or Kenyan coffees in general. So that's an interesting note that I wanted to discuss in this tasting wheel. Outside of that, as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like this is kind of a great opportunity to wrap up the reviews of S&W that we had in general, but as far as this coffee goes, I think by the end it still remained my favorite of the coffees that were featured in that blind taste test, though I think it had such a big head start from the rest of the coffees that the other ones caught up so much more. Both of those naturals improved so much more than this coffee did. I feel like this one started out as the best and it improved only incrementally, where those other coffees had dramatic improvements to them. So they caught up nearly to this one, though by the end I would still say that this one still remained slightly my favorite relative to the other coffees that we did discuss from them. And I've only had a couple of other experiences with the washed Ethiopian and the Burundi coffees that we had as well. Even then I would still say that this one was probably my favorite of any of the coffees that we had from S&W. But as far as my overall thoughts of the S&W coffees that we did review, I do have to say that there's a very high floor for S&W's coffees because they all seemed to improve enough to the point where I wasn't let down or disappointed by any of them, even with them all offering profiles that aren't necessarily in line with my own preferences. Neither of those naturals were typically what I'm looking for in terms of the flavor profiles of naturals, and a lot of people know that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of Kenyan coffees, but the fact that they were better than the average natural processed coffee, this one was better than the average wash processed Kenyan coffee for me, well, that's massive credit to S&W, as all of them did turn out to be very nice, with this one being no exception, as I would say that this is on the better side of Kenyan coffees that I have had this year. But once again, I wouldn't necessarily say that it's going to end up being one of my favorite coffees from the entire year. type of person I would suggest this coffee to. I feel like if you do enjoy your cleaner Kenyan coffees, maybe while being able to sacrifice a slight bit of the body, because I know that's one of the big selling points to people on Kenyan coffees, then this one's a very nice representation of that, because it offered plenty of clarity while still offering plenty of the brighter and berry-like attributes of Kenyan coffees, with a little bit more sweetness as well. So if you're like me and you're willing to make that one trade-off, because I don't think body's quite as important in terms of these coffees to me as it is for a lot of people, then this one's a really nice one because it offers plenty of those other things. And it hit on the big four for me: cleanliness, sweetness, florality, and a fruit-forward profile. Even once again, if the fruit-forward profile is skewing in that Kenyan-like direction that I'm not necessarily the biggest fan of, the fact that it came out candied in multiple directions did make it very enjoyable as well. So I think that's the best direction I can point somebody towards for this one, and the best way I can leave this review. If you've by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here is my review of the Kaguyu AA Wash Processed Kenya from S&W Craft Roasting. Thank you for watching.